Hi guys, welcome to Tactic Devs. In today's video, I'll be showing you guys how to query data from an SQL Server database and then display that data inside a DataGrid control. Now, I already have a project set up here, so without further delay, let's cut to the chase. Now, before I can do anything, the first thing that I need to do is to create a database on our server. Now, if you have Visual Studio installed, it's likely that you also have SQL LocalDB installed on your machine. Now, to verify that, we can make use of command prompt and run some commands to check if there's an instance of LocalDB running on the PC we are using. So I'm just going to open up command prompt by using the shortcut keys, which is the Windows key and the R key. So it's going to open up a window, which is the run window, and I'm going to type in a command cmd. So this will open up command prompt. And inside command prompt, I'll just check if there's an instance of LocalDB installed on our PC. So SQL local DB info. Now this command returns the name of the instance installed. But another thing is I need to ensure that this instance of LocalDB is actually running in the background. So I can do that by just typing in local or SQL local DB start, and it gives you the name started. So this ensures that the instance of LocalDB, which is SQL LocalDB, is actually running. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close that and return to Visual Studio. So inside Visual Studio, just here, I'll click on View, and we have SQL Server Object Explorer here. So I'll just click on that. Okay, so here we have SQL Server, and you can see there's a server called LocalDB. And I'll just open that up, and under databases, we see that there's no database specified. So I'm going to add in a new database, and I'll just give it a name, app data. Okay, so the first step is completed. I have a database. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a table, and I'm going to populate that table with some random data, and we'll actually be reading that data and displaying it in the DataGrid control. Now there's a website called Generate Data, and this website generates random data, so we can actually use that website to generate our data. So I'll just go to my browser, and I'll just type in generate data. So the website is generatedata.com. Okay, so here I can specify the column titles. So I'll specify the first one as name. Now because I used this earlier on, so it remembers what I had inputted in. Address, email, and date of birth. So I also need to specify the data type that I'll be storing in these columns. So for name, I'll just choose names. And for address, street address, email, the same. And for date of birth, I'll just choose date. So these parameters are important. It helps this website actually generate data and specify the types of data. So for the name, I'll set an example, which is John Smith, and this has it has a first name and a last name. And for date of birth, I'll give it a format type, which is MySQL date time format. So I'll set that. Now this is compliant with SQL date time types, so it's okay to use that. And here I can specify the period of time from which it can choose random dates, but I'll just leave that set to the default. Now here under the export types, there is CSV, Excel, JSON, HTML, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select SQL. Okay, so here it asks me to specify the table name. I'm just going to give it a name, employees. Okay, now because I used it earlier on, it actually remembers. And the database type, I'll change this from my SQL to SQL Server. And I'll just unclick this. Now what this does, it's going to create a script, and we are going to use that script to create a table and actually populate data in that table. So here basically it's asking us if we want to create a script that drops that table, that deletes the table, but we don't need that since we are just creating and populating that table. And here we have insert batch size, so basically that's how many times we want to run this query to insert the data, how much data we want for each query. So here I'll actually set that to 100 because I want 100 rows of random data, and here it's already specified 100 rows. Okay, now I'll just verify that everything is okay, and then I'll generate this. Okay, so what has happened now, there's a script here and it'll create a table and then insert some data, some random data generated by this website. So I'll just copy this script and then I'll go back to Visual Studio. Okay, so in Visual Studio I'll just click on SQL Server Object Explorer, and I'll right click on my database that I created earlier on and just click New Query. Okay, so here it creates a file which is an SQL query file and it's empty, and I'll just paste that SQL code I generated on the website. Okay, so here it creates a table employees and there are fields here specified. Now I want to change this date of birth field from var character to date time. Now because date time is a keyword, it's going to change that to blue. And this is going to store our dates. So I'm also going to change this employee's ID. I'll just change that to ID. Okay. Now because this ID is actually a primary key and it's specified here, so that means I also need to change this. Okay, so that's it. Now I'm going to execute this query and we should have data in our table. So here we have 100 rows affected. So I'll go to the Object Explorer and just check for any tables. Okay, so here we see there's a table called employees, and if I right click and view the data, so I can see there's some random data that has been created based on the script that we got from that website. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and close this, and I'll close that as well. Now here in the main window.xaml file, I added in a data grid and I just gave it a name, employees list, and I set some margins around it. And one other thing I did was I added in some styles just to give it a dark theme. So here under window resources, I added in two styles. One targets the data grid column header, and you can see it has been set to a dark blue color here. I also set some properties on the data grid using the style, basically to just give it a dark theme. Okay, now I'm going to be using EntityFramework to access the data in our database. So it's important that I add the namespace assemblies or the packages to the project. Now I've already done that. So if I right click on my project and I go to manage NuGet packages, so here I added in two packages, Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server and Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools. This is going to be very useful because we are going to be using it to basically create some classes. So that's the reason I had this added in. So you can do the same. Okay. Now one of the commands we are going to be using this package is the scaffold db context here. Okay. Now for us to access data using EntityFramework, we need to create a context class. And that context class needs to specify the tables in our database so that it can map that to class types. Now we can actually type in the classes manually, or we can use EntityFramework tools to help us create those classes. So I'm going to do that. So I'll just go to Tools and NuGet Package Manager Console. Okay. Now back to the SQL Server Object Explorer. So here on our database, I'll just select the database, and right here in the Properties panel, I'll look for a property which is connection string. So here I have the connection string to this database specified. So I'll just copy this string and I'll just open my main window.xaml.cs file and then I'll paste this string here. So first I'll add in, just paste it in there. Okay, so I'm going to paste it as a string. So just paste it like that. Now I only need this part of the connection string. I don't need the other parameters. So I'm just going to get rid of that by holding shift, pressing end, and yeah. So basically this is all I need from the connection string. So it specifies the source, which is local DB, and the initial catalog, which is basically the name of the database inside the server. So I'll copy this. Okay, so inside the NuGet Package Manager console, I'm going to type in some commands, and these commands are actually going to create the files and the classes that we're going to be using to access the data. And what I'm going to do is, what happens basically is EntityFramework will search for the tables that are existing inside the database, and it's going to create classes based on the schema of those tables. So I'm just going to type in scaffold db context, and I'll paste in the connection string to the database. Okay, and I'll specify the provider, and in this case we are using Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Okay, and the other parameter is I can specify the output directory. So basically it's going to create a folder and then place those classes inside that folder. But in my case, I want them to just be created inside the root of the project. So I won't specify that. So I'll just go ahead and click enter to run the command. Alright, so with the help of EntityFramework tools, we have tried to reverse engineer the database, and we've created classes based on the table schemas inside. So let's just go ahead and examine the files that have been created. So here we have employee, okay, and we see the schema. So based on the database table, employees, and we also have app data context. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up this file and get rid of unnecessary stuff. So here we have some methods. Let me get rid of this warning here. Okay, so here we have some methods. So we have on model creating. So this is executed when we are creating the database for the first time, and if we are trying to use the code first approach, which means we first create the classes and then we create the database based on the classes. Now in our case, since we already created the database, we won't be needing this. And we're only going to use one constructor here. So we're going to get rid of this. Okay. And one thing is to just, I'll just get rid of this virtual and make sure that the name of this property here is equal to the name of the database table here. So we have employees and we have employees here as well. Okay. So we have employee class and the data context. So we'll be using this context class to access the data in our database. So I'll go to the main window.xaml.cs file here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list property. And this list is going to hold employee class type. So I'm going to just give it a name, my employees. Okay. So inside the constructor, I'm going to now access the data in the database. So I'll be using the using statement. So I'll create a context class object. So that's app data context. Okay. So I'll use this object that I've created here, and the using statement basically means once this object is used, it's going to be disposed, and all the resources attached to this object are going to be released. So I'm going to just query, so using the context. So our context has got a property that's employees, and we saw that earlier on in the context class. So employees, then there's a method which is to list method. So basically what happens here is it's going to query all the employees from the database, and it's going to return a list. And that's the good part about EntityFramework. We deal with queries like objects, basically using link expressions. So I'm going to now save this returned list inside this variable, which is my employees. So once those employees are stored inside the list, I'm now going to bind them to the DataGrid control. So that's employees list. So this is the DataGrid control employees list, and there's a property called item source. So by setting the item source property to my employees list, it's going to bind all the employees inside this list to the DataGrid control, and we should be able to see that data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to test and see. Okay. Alright, so the application is up and running, and we can see that the data has been populated inside the DataGrid control. And when using the DataGrid, it will automatically create the columns based on the properties of the objects being bound. So we have ID, name, address, email, and date of birth. Okay, and this is the same data that we got from the Generate Data website. So guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.